everyone, and welcome to the Priceless Podcast. Today with a new guest. But before we get to our guest, I would like to invite you to like, subscribe, and suggest this podcast to all the people that you think it's going to be useful to. Thank you all who supported this podcast and make this podcast possible. Not only that you supported, but you are continuing your support. This podcast is happening in partnership with the European Forum of LGBT Christian Groups. And today with me is I would call him already kind of a friend. I mean, we never met in person. We only met online and are meeting online again. I met him 5 years ago for the first time through Skype. Now we are meeting through Zoom. He's a professional photographer. In 1988, he founded an organization that was called Courage, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it because we're going to ask Jeremy just in a minute to talk about this himself. So Courage was an organization working on the principles of ex-gay ministries. So my guest today is Jeremy Marks. Welcome, Jeremy. Hello, and how are you today?
I'm very well. Very kind of you to invite me to take part in this podcast. I've seen some of your previous ones, and they're really fascinating. So it's lovely to be with you today and to talk through some of the history we've been through. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Jeremy, for being willing to talk to me about Courage and ex-gay ministry, or as some people know it as conversion therapy or reparative therapy. There are many names that are used for this kind of program. So maybe before we start, I mean, I said two things about you, but maybe you would like to add something. Who is Jeremy?
Oh, right. Well, that's a long story now. But I'm based in Godalming in the county of Surrey in England. And I've always lived in England, but I've travelled quite extensively. And the early part of my life, my first career was as a professional photographer. And that was a very interesting job. It involved me travelling all over the country for a publishing company, taking pictures of cathedrals and stately homes and museums and galleries and royal events. And all the pictures were turned into 35mm colour slides, which some of your older viewers might remember. This is long before digital was even dreamed of. But it's a very interesting job and a very great honour to have done it. Enabled me to know my country well and the geography of it. But all the time I was travelling for that, of course, I was struggling with my sexuality. And the church background I came from, which is an evangelical Baptist church, and a very lively one, I should say, were welcoming and warm and kind towards me. But one never talked about sexuality except to a few trusted pastors or elders, and then only in the context of how I needed to make sure that I was not in any way mixing with the world or taking a worldly view on this, but that I was living a truly Christian life of discipleship and shunning any temptation at all to be involved in homosexuality in relationship terms or in any practicing terms. So the church was happy to have me as long as my behaviour was under control, as they put it. And in those days, of course, with the HIV and AIDS crisis, I found the whole idea of stepping out into the gay world very scary. So in a way, the church may have been a bit prescriptive and anti-gay, but I don't think I felt at the time they were any different to their attitudes towards straight young men who also had to make sure they never had sex before marriage, never ever dabbled in pornography, even masturbation was considered a sin. And as long as we were all living a single life, it didn't seem too bad. I didn't feel I was any worse off than any of them. The problem for me, of course, and what led to me developing a whole new career in ministry, was, or calling, I would say, rather than just a career, was the fact that one by one all my friends got married and I was on my own for years and travelling alone and living a very isolated life. And that's when the struggle with my sexuality and knowing that I would likely never marry or have a life companion was hard to bear when I was in my mid-30s. Long answer to your first question.
That's fine. That's fine. Thank you for letting us know a little bit about you. So I mentioned you founding Courage. Can you tell us a little bit what Courage was?
Okay. Well, again, I should preface it by saying that in my struggles, I started reaching out for help because the local church obviously couldn't do more than pray and tell me to be a good boy. So I found another English ministry called True Freedom Trust in the mid-1980s, which was a long-established ministry full of compassion and kindness, led by a man called Martin Hallett, who believed that you couldn't be a practicing gay man and a Christian, but that nevertheless it was a real struggle and you needed fellowship and support and so on. So I got involved with them and went to a local support group, well, actually in London, for some years, where I met a young man visiting from the United States and another ex-gay ministry called Love in Action. And that was in Northern California, just north of San Francisco. And he had a very, very interesting testimony. And that resulted in me going to work with Love in Action for 4 or 5 months on a kind of training basis in 1987. So I lived in with their live-in ministry, and the whole idea was that we needed to find the way out of homosexuality, how to not be gay anymore, not only to stop behaving in any wrong way, as it would seem then, but also to become heterosexual and marry. And the ethos behind it was, we're all made by God, male and female and heterosexual, and being gay or homosexual was like a kind of aberration. It was like having your mind distorted by the way of the world and our hedonistic society, and that we needed to resist that and come into the fullness of our true heterosexual identity. As Christians, that was the idea. And at the time, as I know it sounds extraordinary to look back on now, but at the time it was the most credible kind of theory and proposition, because prior to that, the church just thought all gay people will go to hell. That's it. And even to talk about being gay was a sin. Never mind acting on it. But the American ministry, Love in Action, was a very positive environment. They were believing God to do great things, and it was a vibrant community and an exciting place to be. And I couldn't stay there for that long because I was having to finance it entirely myself. So when the money ran out, I knew I had to come back. And my local church then thought I should begin something like it in the UK. And True Freedom Trust, lovely though it was, were much more cautious in the idea of proclaiming you could change. I think they probably thought it was unlikely, but okay, so we want to be open to everything if it's possible. That's fine. But I wanted something a bit more proactive, and was really going to find the way forward so that people could change. I didn't want to remain stuck in a kind of plateau where we were all, ex-gay in the sense that we weren't practicing, but not moving on anywhere else.
Yeah, but isn't that that's kind of, from my knowledge, what I heard from many people who were part of ex-gay ministry, that there was, although they didn't promise that you will change, but most of the people really hoped that they will change and become straight.
Yes, exactly. And also at the time, you see, the charismatic movement had become quite a big thing in the United States and in the UK. And with the charismatic movement and the restoration of gifts of the Spirit was the expectation that God would bring healing. And so in our churches and conferences, people would go forward to be prayed for healing from cancers and from heart disease and from disabilities or all sorts of things, with the expectation that God was powerful enough to heal and might well do so if we have enough faith. So, of course, in that context, the idea of God healing the homosexual, well, why ever not? If he could save a person's life from other life-threatening things, why could he not change a person from being gay to straight? Yeah. It all seemed very logical in those days. And certainly there was nobody else offering anything else. There was one other group in the UK, and I know there were many in the States, which were at least notionally Christian and pro-gay. The one I'm thinking of was the lesbian and gay Christian movement in the UK. And they were quite clear that to be gay was fine in the sight of God, and you could be in a relationship and have sex, and that would be no problem. But they certainly were not evangelical at all in their theological outlook. And so there was a big gulf. I mean, most of us as evangelicals are brought up to believe that anybody who is not an evangelical is not even a Christian. That they were just sort of liberals, or had an airy-fairy kind of idea of what the Christian faith was about, and they weren't serious about discipleship. So in other words, the lesbian and gay Christian movement had no appeal for people like me or other evangelicals, because we thought they were heretics, basically. It seemed black and white, and so we had to find our own way, and this was the only way that seemed open to us to try the ex-gay route, and the only positive things that seemed to be happening for Christian LGBT people at that time was the ex-gay movement. And I do believe, looking back, actually it was quite cutting edge, because you have to remember, in those days most churches, they would look at Romans chapter 1, and they would say that the important thing is to follow Christ, but those who refuse to worship God or give him thanks, God turned his back on them and abandoned them to doing all these sinful things, which included lustful homosexual acts. So in the minds of most churches and Christians, if you were experiencing homosexual feelings, this was the sign that you had already been abandoned by God and were destined for hell. So the idea of there being a gay Christian was an impossible thing to contemplate in those days. You were either a Christian and you turned your back on all of that, or you were gay and you turned your back on God. And that was the black and white thinking of those days. So the ex-gay movement, which was saying, oh no, actually you can be Christian and you may well experience these temptations, and it is temptation. It's not sinful to be tempted. Jesus was tempted, and we just have to find a way as disciples of Christ to not slip into a lifestyle of that temptation, falling for it, and find our way out. And so the cutting edge side of it was that we were actually proclaiming to churches, you need to recognize that you have brothers and sisters and trans people amongst you who are gay or are GLBT, and they are part of the Christian fellowship, just like every other kind of sinner can be part of it. And we walk together to form a society where we are people who proclaim Christ and live a Christian life. So if the ex-gay movement of those days had continued to pioneer and keep seeking God for cutting-edge thinking, then we would have found our way to realizing, as we did, of course, later on, that to resist being gay or to imagine we could be healed from it was not right. But the trouble is, the ex-gay movement had struggled so hard to gain any credibility at all in the eyes of the institutional churches that once they began to be listened to, and I tell you, it took us until right into the mid-1990s before they would even listen to us. They would regard us with the utmost suspicion. I mean, I'd have church leaders saying, well, it can't be right for you to have gatherings of gay men, Christian men. I mean, just asking for trouble, isn't it? So they thought we were all jumping in and out of bed with one another, having mad sex. They had no idea what Christian community life was like, and that actually that's not the way it works at all. So, of course, once we got credibility with the churches, I think at that point the ex-gay movement settled into believing they'd found the right way and stopped seeking God for the way forwards. And that was where the problem arose, with it becoming an entrenched, toxic kind of ministry that set people up for loss of their faith, a terrible sense of disappointment in God because they never got healed, and so on. And of course that led me to question everything during the late 1990s and start thinking we've got this all very wrong. And then that took us into the next phase, but I won't go into that now.
Yes. Before you go into this, I would like to ask you, what are some methods that were used by Courage, but also by other ex-gay movements to change the sexuality?
Right. Well, yes, it was a very varied picture, to be perfectly honest. Most of the ex-gay ministries that I knew around the world were started up by people who were quite oddballs, really, who wanted to do something positive, but brought their own brokenness, if you like, their own neuroses into the situation. And some would believe that homosexuality was being demonized. Others believed that healing of memories was required. Others believed it was just a discipleship issue. So they were not all doing the same things. And the Love in Action model where I trained was actually, I think, still one of the most sane and reasonable of the ministries, in that it never tried to make great promises. It didn't try to get into any way out sort of techniques or anything like that. They were basically, the view was, and the view we embraced, was that we all come to Christ as broken people and as sinful people. And the answer to all of that is that you follow Christ as closely as you possibly can. You make Jesus the center of your life, your thinking, your choice of career, your choice of partner. Jesus comes first in everything. The Lordship of Christ is above all. And if you are following Christ wholeheartedly, then all these other problems should fall away. There's this theory that homosexuality was something that thrived in an environment that encouraged it. And if you were getting good fellowship in environments which repudiated it, then it should kind of drop away and you wouldn't be troubled by it eventually. Well, that sounded okay at first. When you 10 years later and you were still experiencing the same pressures and difficulties and it was getting worse, you had to start thinking there's something wrong with this picture.
Yeah.
But for us, it was primarily offering a discipleship program with a lot of Bible study, a lot of prayer, and where we were aware that there were particular issues of trauma, we would try to pray through those for people, or we did, in fact, refer people for psychiatric help sometimes, for specialist counselling help to others who were trained in offering that kind of thing. We did come under some criticism after the first early years because we weren't being, apparently in some people's minds, radical enough. And the Living Waters program became a big thing. You'll know about Living Waters. And they were much more into healing prayer than we had been. And that made us feel as though we'd somehow missed it. You know, we were not being charismatic enough, not using the power of the Holy Spirit enough. But we tried to be open to anything that God might want to teach us. But anyway, it kind of, the excitement of the early days leveled off when we realized that for all of our efforts, we weren't actually getting anywhere.
Yeah, you were mentioning that people at some point started asking something is wrong with the program. But I guess for many people, it wasn't just something's wrong with the program, but there is something wrong with me. So can you tell us a little bit, what were the consequences for LGBT people of taking part in ex-gay ministry?
Well, I think amazingly, most people came with this great sense of expectation that God was going to do something amazing. So when they'd been with us in the most incredibly dedicated way, and many of them had given up careers, they'd left their homes, they'd come to live in our community houses, and having given up so much, which I have to say is more than many other Christians give up routinely in church, having done that, after a couple of years when they were really not making any real progress, they would start being filled with self-doubt. I mean, they'd come from a background of being filled with self-doubt because the church had told them they were terrible sinners and they were lucky to even be considered, that God would love them. But those feelings of self-doubt came back in a very major way. And then I think it kind of split. Some people would just go downhill and become very severely depressed and even suicidal. And others would start saying, there's something not right about this. I can't believe this is really the way it should be as a Christian. And I don't really feel that I'm such a bad person. What does it matter, perhaps, if I love somebody of the same sex? Is that really so bad? So I think that the healthier ones who had a bit more healthy self-esteem were able to ask the question, what really is so wrong with being gay. If God doesn't change me, then maybe it's because I need to accept who I am. And I have to say that the people who started down that route were the best off. I could see they were the healthiest amongst us. And that's when I started seeing that happening. I didn't want to stop their progress. I felt I could see the good fruit of an increasing self-acceptance, and so I didn't discourage that. Which of course perplexed some people, because they were expecting me as a ministry leader to say, oh, no, that can't possibly be right. And certainly lots of other ministry leaders were saying that. But I was saying, well, we have sought God sincerely, wholeheartedly for years. So if this is a more wholesome place to be, then we need to see what God's saying about it.
Was there somewhere behind also your hope for yourself that maybe you'll someday be able to go into this direction and find a wholesome life by accepting yourself as a gay man?
I think that, for me, came much later, because I haven't had a chance to mention yet that quite early on in the Courage ministry, well, we began in 1988, and in 1991 I got married to a lady called Bren, and she had been a pioneer in Christian circles for women in leadership, and she'd been the first woman in this country to lead a church. So she was quite a pioneering spirit and recognized the same thing in me, and we were good friends who admired one another. And we thought, well, both of us were single and both of us were inclined to work too hard, and maybe, a marriage of companionship would be a lot better than being on our own. And since theologically I couldn't see any other way forward, we built up a relationship and decided to get married. And that was a long story, but once I'd got married, my whole focus for me was on being a good husband and a faithful husband. And because my wife had married a man who's running an ex-gay ministry, that was a very, very disturbing thing for her in a way, because she saw me working all the time with men who were trying not to be gay, with varying degrees of success, or rather, I should say, no success. And I think it's interesting now looking back, because I think intuitively she thought, well, this may add up theologically to a certain extent, but it doesn't feel right. And I think she intuitively recognized that probably long before I was ready to. And funnily enough, I think she moved towards a gay affirming position quite a bit before I did, although she was in this invidious position of wanting to be able to see other people freed from all the trauma, but she didn't want me to be, because I was her husband. So that was a very tense, difficult situation.
Yeah.
But I can go on to that later, of course. But by the year 2000, I had abandoned the whole ex-gay process. I mean, this had been going on for me for about 5 years, even longer actually, because I'd sometimes tell the story. We began in January 1995 with a New Year's meeting for our group. And I said at the beginning of the meeting, I said, if anybody has come here to this meeting hoping that we can change you from gay to straight, go home. We can't do this. It doesn't happen. Not for me, not for anybody. We are gay people who have got to find the way forward and see what a Christian life for LGBT people means. Now, in those days, we thought it had to at least mean celibacy, and we certainly didn't expect it to mean relationship, but we were done with the ex-gay process. And I wanted that to be clear with people, because I didn't want them to be under the false impression that something more was going to change. I think new people still came expecting it would change, but that was in a sense not my problem. I'd already stated that I didn't think it was going to happen.
You will come back to the change of courage in a second, but before we go on, I wanted to ask you, courage was, even by your words, pretty mild. You didn't go like into this healing prayer or casting out demons, but there were.
We didn't even really do that actually. I'd been through quite a lot of deliverance ministry myself before courage ever began. It never worked for me, and I really didn't believe in it. I wasn't going to say it was impossible for demonic deliverance to be appropriate in certain extreme circumstances. So, for instance, when we had a chap come to us who'd been heavily involved in the occult, and I didn't think that had anything whatever to do with his homosexuality, but that was a separate issue. There could have been deliverance needed in that case, but generally speaking, I had given up on the idea of deliverance and was very, very wary of it. Although people did seek deliverance ministry while they were with us, and sometimes found it from other people. Not that it was effective, of course. It didn't do what they hoped it would do.
Yeah. So when you look at those other ministries, like what kind of stories did you hear? I mean, it's interesting. You started changing, obviously, your mind very early. But when we hear stories of ex-gay ministries that stopped working in the States, and unfortunately there are still ex-gay ministries that are working somewhere underground, somewhere pretty openly, and they're being even encouraged nowadays by churches, not like in the 80s that churches have a problem with it, but they're even supporting it and trying to spread this kind of work. So, why do you think that ex-gay ministry is really dangerous for LGBT people?
Well, there's one fundamental reason for it being so dangerous, and that is that it is wrong in its understanding of homosexuality right from the start. So a person growing up today who discovers they're gay in their teens, for instance, and living in an affirming society like Britain is today, although there are still plenty of prejudices around or issues that might make them feel nervous about coming out, nevertheless, generally speaking, in much of society, certainly like in the London area, you wouldn't expect to have a hard time if you came out and said you were gay. And people would just take that as read, that was okay, yes, and look forward to meeting your boyfriend or for a young man or whatever. But back in the days when we were starting, they were saying that not only is it fundamentally wrong and immoral to ever have a gay relationship, but that there was something deeply disordered about you to even have those kinds of feelings, because they were considered abnormal, ungodly, in fact, fundamentally set in rebellion to God, thinking of that passage from Romans chapter 1. And therefore you had a deep pathological issue you've got to get over. And of course, if you add to people's low sense of self-esteem already by piling on them guilt for having the feeling that there's something terribly wicked and wrong, and of course that's why we have AIDS, isn't it? Clear that's God's judgment. But back in the 80s, I mean, everybody, most of society included, was saying, well, it's obvious God's judging homosexuals because of the AIDS crisis, and they are getting what they deserve. That was the attitude. So, of course, what you were doing is crushing the person at a very, very deep level to such an extent, and then promising that that can all change if only they're obedient to God. It gives them the double whammy of destroying their relationship with God as well, because by the time you've lived with that kind of doctrine for a few years, you're so disturbed by the idea of a relationship with God that you don't want that either. So there is no doubt that it is hugely damaging at a very deep level, and it's a great tragedy. But I still have to say, for those who are very damning about ex-gay ministry, had we not started to push the boat out and say we've got to have a different approach, we wouldn't be where we are today. The ex-gay ministries in the early days were the pioneers who at least were saying, let's believe that we have some hope in God. Even as gay people, we have some hope in God. And those who found that hope in God and then came to believe, as I did and many others, that you are fully accepted as a gay person by God and you can have a fully blessed same-sex relationship, those are the people who come through to a very much more healthy state, and indeed a much richer state, because we've been through so much that we have a lot of wisdom to share with lots of other people who in life don't go through the mill in such a way.
So let's go to the change now. Courage changed its mind was it in the year 2000 officially?
Well, that's when we announced our change of policy.
Yes. And so what happened that you changed your mind?
Right.
Yeah, how was that journey of changing your mind?
Well, I have to say it was a very messy process in the early days, because all the people who'd come were kind of always tensed up, trying to resist the temptation to get too involved with somebody. And interestingly enough, there's always some interesting side stories to these things. But when people came to Courage, they used to say, well, at least I could be sure that once a week when I came to the meeting, I could have lots of hugs, and that was absolutely fine. And I wasn't going to be afraid someone was coming on to me or propositioning me. I was just able to enjoy the warmth and the tactile feelings of being in this community, which was committed to celibacy. Once we started saying, well, maybe, you might meet somebody and fall in love and have a relationship and so on, and you may actually, on the way to that, find yourself attempting a relationship and not working, but still it might be legitimate that you should find a relationship. Then, of course, everyone was kind of being very careful. They didn't want to reach out and hug one another because they thought that might give the wrong message, which had a very bad effect on a lot of the more lonely people on the edges of our community who didn't make relationships easily. They had all sorts of problems. We had a lot of autistic people who came, actually, who were difficult people to relate to anyway, sometimes, because they don't have that ease of empathy and ability to make relationships. And suddenly they were feeling on the margins. Suddenly their needs for Christian fellowship and companionship and warmth and so on were not being met. So one of the great ironies of becoming free to consider a relationship, a same-sex partnership, was actually then thwarting some of the other good things that had been happening in the fellowship. But nothing is ever a straightforward path. And very gradually, over the next 5 or 6 years, I suppose, people settled down to recognize we were a fellowship which fully accepted and affirmed gay people as they are and their relationships if they find one. And we weren't encouraging people just to go sleeping around or leading a promiscuous life, but we didn't see why you should just exchange a very disciplined life for a completely promiscuous life. It didn't seem to make any sense. We would try and carry on that sense of discipleship right the way through and say Christ still comes first. So we're going to be careful in the way we relate to one another, but we can have a hope that some healthy relationships will come out of it, which they did. Most of the people who then got into good same-sex partnerships that later led to civil partnerships legally or marriage eventually, most of them became very good role models for other people, because you could see how much their lives changed for the better when they were in a stable partnership and they were committed to one another and able to move on. But it was a messy process, I have to say. I would like to have shut Courage down in 2000 and started something else, which had a different ethos. But oddly enough, I think the fact that we had this very difficult process of morphing from one rather toxic kind of ministry into something new enabled people to do that journey. And everybody was on a journey. And some people started coming back to us in the early 2000s who'd been with us in the late 1980s saying, oh, I'm so relieved to hear you saying that it's okay to be gay. I've been thinking that myself, but nobody was saying this, you see, not in the Christian. And now you are, and I feel I can come back. And some of them from those early days came back, which was wonderful. Whereas some of the people who'd been there in the middle years left in disgust because they thought I'd become a heretic.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting when I listen to you, like you started the process of changing your mind started quite early, especially comparing to many organizations, other organizations that did ex-gay ministry. Yeah, we don't need to name them, but there are some really big organizations that were back then. And it took them a long time. Why is it? Like, what do you think kept them on going if they realized that it's not working, that people are not really changing their sexuality?
Well, I think there are two things there. One is that, very different things actually. One is that first and foremost, before anything else, in my heart I was a pastor, and I cared about the well-being spiritually of anybody who came to me, whether they were gay or straight or whatever the situation was. I would always listen to people and try to encourage them in their faith and to try and make sense of their faith in the context of whatever struggles they were facing. So for me, a good outcome was not just about becoming straight. A good outcome was coming to a place of joy and happiness in their faith in Christ. Because fundamentally the scriptures teach the joy of the Lord is your strength. So if that is to be true, and I deeply believe it is, then if people weren't finding joy because of their Christian walk, then they were losing one of the most important tools, if you like, to living a more healthy, wholesome life. And so therefore, if teaching that you can't be gay and Christian was actually destroying that joy, killing the joy and making people feel more depressed, then there must be something wrong with that thinking. So it was my pastoral concern for the people that enabled me to start thinking outside the box. And I didn't see that same pastoral concern in most of the other ex-gay ministries. I did see it in a few, and very interestingly enough, and this is mainly in the UK I saw it, there were a few other ministries led by straight Christians reaching out to help the gay community. And they had started their ex-gay ministries because, again, they were taught by us that was the way to do it. But they were really concerned for these people and wanted to help. And when I started moving to a more affirming view, the straight people who were running ministries were much more accepting than the others. It was the ex-gay ministries led by gay people who were most resistant, because they were saying, no, I haven't, spent my life and given up my career and to do this ministry just to change my mind about it. We got to press on. So that was one dynamic. And the other dynamic, of course, was that most of us as ministries struggled terribly financially to, even manage to make any kind of a living. I mean, in the process of my work, I lost my home. I lost absolutely everything. Everything I had that I put into the ministry to finance it went, and the support base from the church or other places never came, or did a small amount, but not really very significantly. So for those ex-gay ministries that had begun to build some credibility and get financial support from churches, they could not afford to change their minds. But I think for me, maybe there's just a reckless side to me, but I think I'd lost so much. I thought, well, if I lose their support, okay, so be it. So we rent a home, and as we did, we'll do without house ownership and the other things. Well, if necessary, I'll have to just go and get another job. So in other words, I was not quite so wedded to the financial support, limited though it was anyway, coming from churches, that I couldn't change my mind. And I think lots of churches and pastors in churches today face the same situation. I know quite a lot of church leaders who say, I'm very sympathetic for your journey and what you're doing, but of course I couldn't possibly say that in my church because I would lose my job. And I have a wife and children to support and a manse to live in. I would lose everything. So being paid for doing Christian work has the huge drawback that you end up having to satisfy your supporters, and it's not a good principle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a bit scary actually when I think about that. Yeah. So, there's one thing that I was wondering for a long time, and I warned you up front that I'm going to ask you that question. I listened to some leaders who decided to close down the ex-gay ministries and talking about many horrible things that people did to themselves because of this ex-gay ministry or the ex-gay ministries.
Yes.
And also people went into depression and had other mental health issues afterwards. Once you decide to continue, and I'm aware that your ministry was from what I hear, was very people oriented, and you were taking care about the people and not bashing them, even if they decided to pursue a same-sex relationship.
Yes.
But how does one, like, I'm thinking of these leaders, how do they live with this knowledge of, I did something, yes, I did have good intentions, but still this had a major negative side effect for
Yes.
LGBT people. How do you continue your life after that?
This is a very good question. I think the only thing that I and many others who've been formerly in ex-gay ministry, and I'm thinking of particularly a good friend called John Smid, who was in Love in Action until about 2008 before he finished. The best we can do really is to speak openly about the fact we were wrong, and that we were doing our best, but our best was still extremely damaging for people, and that what our message now has to be: come to God as you are and realize you are loved fully as the human being you are, and find a new life, really. And for an awful lot of people, that has been very fruitful. And I've known hundreds now who've moved right away from the ex-gay ministry days and have found partnerships and have found a lot of joy and happiness and settled into lives. There are a number of people who are, I'd say, of my age and older, who have not found partners. And although they've come to terms with the fact that they are gay, they're still lonely and in isolation. And I feel that's the saddest thing of all, that they have been ruined almost for the possibility of finding a relationship because of their having lived a life of toxic spirituality that has damaged them so badly. And I suppose theoretically, if one worked with them enough and intensely enough, they could get over that. But it is harder as you get older as a gay man to contemplate a life with a partner. I mean, I'm in a situation now where I am married to my partner who's 30 years younger than me, and he pursued me. It was very interesting because I wasn't even thinking about it. I was still with my wife when I first met him, although I was at the point of deciding that we would separate. And when he came along into my life, I thought, well, I'm not interested in this. You're far too young. I wouldn't dream of making a relationship with somebody so much younger. It's just not appropriate. And everything in me really resisted, which ironically had the effect of him being more interested. So a strange dynamic, really. But anyway, he was persistent. He waited for years. We were just thinking about it again last night. He waited for about 4 years before I was ready to. And he tried finding other relationships, and he didn't meet anybody that he really wants to be with, and would keep finding himself talking about me to these other people. So I'd say, well, I think if you're that keen on Jeremy, you better go. But the thing is, for me, it was almost like an act of God to bring a young man into my life who really was interested in me from his own heart. It wasn't anything, I hadn't ever drawn him into it. And it was as if God was restoring the years the locusts have eaten for me, in a way. And I have seen this happen for some other people too. In fact, we went to a very interesting celebration of a group of gay men. It was about 3 or 4 years ago. And all of them had much younger partners. And I said to the host, I said, did you deliberately invite people who had this big age gap between partners? They said, oh, no, they just happened to be my friends, so I invited them. And I just realized that something amazing had happened that enables you to find restoration and recover those years you've lost. But of course, it does mean making huge adjustments, because that generation's difference means you can't afford to be the old man you've become. You've got to be young at heart and be prepared to make big changes in your life to adjust. So, but it's worth it. Absolutely worth it.
I'm so happy for you. Thank you for sharing this story. Did you ever have someone blaming you for what you did? And
yes.
How was that for you, and how did you manage to cope with this?
Well, yes, I have had a few people do that. Of course, each one's different, but I think one person in particular had suffered nightmares for years of just, couldn't seem to get the memories of some of the things that happened to him through that process out of his head. And I was very upset to hear that, because the last thing I would have wanted was to suffer anything like that. And in fact, I think he has found some help through other counselling and other pastoral care. Well, maybe not Christian, I don't know exactly. But all I could really do was to say, to apologise and say, we did what we thought was right at the time. And as lots of other people had done as well from lots of other churches, none of us were acting with any sort of malice or wrong intent. And it is a very tough journey, and we hope that you'll be able to find a way through it, as indeed we all have had to try and find a way. Because the most aggressive time was actually when I was speaking at a meeting, and this man, who I don't think he was gay himself, but he just was interested in the subject, and he was very aggressive, saying, "What are you doing to make restitution to all these people you've damaged so badly?" And I said, "Well, what would you expect me to do? I mean, what practically could you do in such circumstances? All you can do is explain where you've gone wrong on the journey you've been on, and recognise they were on a journey too. And everybody in life goes through heaps of battles that, some people, heterosexual, might lose children or have a child who goes off the rails completely and dies, or all kinds of terrible things happen to people in life. And there is no magic solution to any of it, and it's no one person's fault. It's part of the tapestry of life that we all go through. And for us, it's the journey has been a tough one, going through the whole coming to terms with being gay. But I don't think there's any way of avoiding that. I see young people today facing horrendous kinds of challenges that we didn't face when I was growing up, especially with the advent of modern technology and all the things that can do. And there's going to be a whole generation there who will then be protesting at the providers of that technology, saying, "You ruined my life." But you have to get through it somehow. You've just got to find a way.
Yeah, thank you for that. I actually hear what you're saying, and it just reminded me, we so often just wanna, when we are hurt, we wanna project our pain towards one person, but it's just like this whole system that was not healthy at that point. Where it was also, if someone entered an ex-gay ministry, especially if they were grown up, it was also their decision. Unfortunately, of course, there were also many teenagers who were forced by their parents to enter some of these ex-gay ministries.
That was something we never did. We never had any teenagers involved. So.
And that I can imagine, it wasn't their decision, but it's something they had to do, and they didn't have a choice.
That's right.
But for many people, it was a choice, and often it is easier for us to just kind of pass on the responsibility. It's important to acknowledge the pain of the people, but and our mistakes, but at the same time, we have to cope with our pain and our decisions. Personal decisions. So unfortunately, there are still ex-gay ministries that are trying to do the same work. Maybe they're called differently. Maybe it's getting less in the West. But although I heard that there are still ex-gay ministries, even in the West, but in some Eastern countries, the number of these ministries is actually growing. So what would you, first of all, say to LGBTIQ people who are considering to enter this ex-gay ministry or conversion therapy, or however they call it? And also, what message would you give to the leaders or pastors who are encouraging LGBT people to take part in this?
It's a difficult one, because the countries where some of these ex-gay ministries are developing now are often either very Roman Catholic in their outlook, where there's still a very strong sense of condemnation, or actually where there are strong political right-wing or strong left-wing governments which want to uphold the idea that we don't have any gay people here, or Muslim countries too. We don't have any gay people here, and then when they do turn up, they've got to have somewhere to send them that shows a compassionate response. And the difficulty is that I think, with today's internet, of course, the knowledge that you can be gay and Christian is now out there and available for anybody to read about if they're prepared to do the research, and many do. And so they know that it's wrong. And I think the internet, in that respect, can have an immensely valuable effect for people who are searching, as they can find out themselves. But I don't think there's any easy thing to say to somebody who lives in those countries. I'm in correspondence with a young man who's in one of the African countries where they are. I mean, he'd be killed by the people in his village if they knew he was gay. And he's just living a life of abject fear all the time. And there's nothing I can say to him that will calm that. I'm not there to talk to him face to face or anything like that. I'm just having to reassure him there's somebody out there who understands and is praying for him. And I sort of recognize that kind of spiritual tyranny, having lived through it myself when I was growing up, of abject fear that if you ever dared to open your mouth about it, then you would be utterly condemned and maybe subject to violence. It may even be that for some countries where they have ex-gay ministries, where there's that kind of environment, that it's at least a safe place because they can claim that they're doing something about it. And they will at least meet other gay people there. I mean, we had a program which came from Love in Action called Steps Out of Homosexuality, which was basically a discipleship course. And people joked to us later on that really, rather than being steps out of homosexuality, it was leaps into homosexuality, because we all met other gay people and found that we were not so peculiar after all, and we had an environment where we understood each other. And there is something to be said for that. The ex-gay ministries undoubtedly provided a safe place as a stepping stone to coming to terms with who they really are. So the best that can be hoped for, I think, in some of those spiritually tyrannical countries is that God will use it to meet people where they are in circumstances that are too hostile for them to meet anywhere else. So,
what would you tell church leaders who are encouraging their LGBT members to enter an ex-gay ministry?
Well, I would say do your research and stop being so puerile in your what you're saying, because you have the same scriptures that I have. You have all the access to the same knowledge that I have. Read and inform yourself. But a lot of people just don't wish to know. That's the trouble. But it's fascinating to me that so many pastors in this country have changed their minds, have done so because they've discovered they've got a gay son or a lesbian daughter or a brother-in-law who's gay or somebody close to them, and they just think, oh, this person's okay. So they don't meet the stereotype of this wicked, evil person that I thought they would be. So maybe I've got this wrong. And I know quite a few people in that situation, and they've begun to completely rethink it and then try and bring their churches on board.
So you talked a little bit about before I stop this whole interview, I want to hear how your story ended. Well, we heard a part that you are married to a man now,
yes.
But you also mentioned you were married to a woman. How did your story end?
Thank you. Yes, that's it was rather wonderful, actually, and I'm glad you've reminded me to say. Yes, when I got married to my wife in 1991, I fully intended it to be a marriage for life, and I didn't expect, of course, it to change. But it was very difficult for her and for me all the years we were together. But it's not without some value in terms of, we did love and care for each other, of course. And when I left in 2012, I said to her, look, I feel I've got to leave because I'm never, ever going to be able to be truly me as long as I'm under the same roof, because everybody's just going to think we're a married couple that we're managing somehow. and they're not going to, recognise that I'm a gay man who shouldn't be in this. And that was very distressing for her. And I just said, look, I will always be there for you. I will be your friend. I will support you in everything. And I did. The next 8 years, I couldn't have done more to support her. I helped her move house. I would stay with her when she had surgery and needed support, everything I could do. But I said, we've got to be free to go our separate ways. And she didn't want to ever marry anybody else either. That's the other thing. I'm not interested in marrying anybody else. I didn't even want to think about it, you see. And then I began getting close to Paolo, and she had to recognise that I had a partner and she wouldn't be coming back to me. And I think it probably took about 8 years before she began to be ready to seriously contemplate meeting somebody else. And although it was a rough ride at first, she did then meet another man, a lovely Christian man whose wife had died some years earlier, and who was looking, didn't want to be on his own anymore. And they hit it off, and they started to build a relationship quite quickly. And I just encouraged her all the way, to such an extent that when they decided they were going to get married, we were then able to push our divorce proceedings through quite quickly and very amicably. And then she got married last August in 2020, and I walked her down the aisle of the church and gave her away to her new husband, which was the most amazing and wonderful thing to do, and signed my name on the register witnessing her getting married to him. And then she and her husband came to my marriage to Paolo, and she signed the register for me. And it was a wonderful way of bringing closure to the years where we really had tried to do our very best, to be faithful to one another, to do our best for one another. And I hope and pray that many other couples can do that, when they realise they've got to bite the bullet and recognise that a mixed orientation marriage doesn't work for either of them. And instead of hating each other or being resentful, can be forgiving and accepting and help one another to move forward. So.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Before we end this, I actually wanted to show the people, if they want to know a little bit more about your story, especially about courage and your journey towards changing your mind about everything. It's in this book. Can you tell our viewers and listeners where they can obtain maybe a copy of this book if they want to read it?
Well, thank you very much. Yes, it's called Exchanging the Truth of God for a Lie. And I can post a copy to you if you inquire through the Courage website. That's courage.org.uk. And it is also available through Amazon on Kindle.
Okay.
So you can get a Kindle version and download it, which is the cheapest and quickest way of getting it. And yes, I'd be very pleased if people would like to get a copy, not because I make any money from it, but because I'm keen for people to really see for themselves what the journey was about.
Yeah. So if you're interested, you can find the links in the podcast description where you can find these books. Thank you, Jeremy, so much for opening up.
Can I just mention there's a German edition of it as well, but it's under a different title, Really Gay, Really Christian in German. So there's a German version.
We'll put the link to that too. So if you rather have a German copy, you can also find that. Thank you, Jeremy, so much for opening up to us and talking about your journey, your story, your work. I wanted to ask you if anyone wants to contact you and talk to you, is that possible, and how?
Absolutely, yes. Best thing to do is to email me, jeremy@courage.org.uk, and I'll respond to that, and then we can work out how to do it, whether to meet by Zoom or just correspond by email or whatever. I'm very open to doing that, or meeting up when we're allowed to.
Great. So you heard Jeremy. If you want to talk to him, have some questions, or just he likes doing pastoral care. If you want someone who can do that for you, you can contact Jeremy. So thank you so much for being with us today. I'm sending all my greetings to you. If you want to support either the European Forum of LGBT Christian groups or this Priceless Podcast, the links how you can do it is also in the podcast description. as well as I can't remember now if we mentioned something else. We'll put the links there too. Well, thank you for being with us. I'm saying bye from me. My name is Michael Secen, and see you in the next episode. Until then, bye.
Bye.